where do you want to go from there, Matthew?
Well, let's tie it all together, right? So if it's, we've ruled out thermite for sure, we've ruled out nukes, we've ruled out Bin Laden and his cell phone. So let's have a talk. There's a guy in Canada called John Hutchison. So let's move on to him and his experiments. And he started, 70s? I think he started doing his experiments.
That's right. Now, we're sort of taking a slight jump sideways here, but we're going to see, well,
we've got like 15 minutes left, I think, on my clock.
Okay.
So if we can just, so let's just let people get give them an understanding of what type of energy was used. So it's like, give them a working theory.
What we're talking about, I've talked already about electrostatic field in a hurricane. Electrostatic energy is like when you stroke your cat and you get a shock off it, or, you stop your car at a petrol pump, you touch the petrol pump, you get a spark. What's happened is your car has collected electrostatic energy, collected electrons, and then you're discharging when you touch the pump or you touch the roof of your car or the door or whatever. Same around a hurricane. You've got this huge electrostatic field, or any thunderstorm. Everyone knows that. I mean, what creates lightning, for heaven's sake? It's electricity. Everyone knows there is electricity associated with the storm system. We've also talked about the magnetic field. Well, guess what? John Hutchison, as you introduced there, is a Canadian researcher. He has been doing research into mixing together different forms of energy, such as electrostatic fields from a Van de Graaff generator or from a Tesla coil. And he's been mixing together magnetic fields from large magnets and this sort of thing. And he's also mixed together microwave energy using microwave generators. It's called a magnetron tube, if anybody didn't know that. And he used radar equipment. And he started fiddling around with this because he was trying to reproduce some of Nikola Tesla's experiments and get equipment together. He's just a tinkerer. He's not a trained physicist. He hasn't been to university. He hasn't, worked in a university laboratory. He just got an intuitive feel for inventing things, collecting things together. I've spoken to John at length because of what we haven't had time to cover, but I'll mention it very briefly now. Because we knew that this was correct, a lot of this evidence was submitted to court in a challenge to some of the NIST contractors in 2007, Dr. Wood's court case with Attorney Jerry Leapart. I helped prepare some of the documents for that in 2007. I've written a little bit about this in my free book, 9/11 Finding the Truth, which can be downloaded free, and the audiobook is free. That's from my website. Everybody who wants to download that, it's all free. So John, and I talk about John Hutchison in there as well. And so he'd been doing these experiments, and what was he creating? Well, guess what? He was creating things like the jellification of metal. So what's jellification of metal another form of? Well, it's another form of molten metal, isn't it? So he was taking a solid bar of aluminium and partly turning it to jelly with his mixing together of electrical energy, microwaves, magnetic fields. He had 2 tons of equipment to do this, 2 tons of equipment. Yet the energy to do this was a maximum of 1.5 kilowatts of energy that were used in these experiments. So what's 1.5 kilowatts? Well, a kettle in the UK to boil a cup of tea is 3 kilowatts of electricity these days, 3 kilowatts. So he's not using like a huge, massive, he's using a regular wall outlet to power his equipment. He's not using a whole lot of, power station or anything like that. Yet he's able to create these jellification effects in metal. He's able to make stainless steel rust. He's able to change one metal into another metal. He's able to levitate things to make them lift off and fly out of the area.
With those cars, we touched the cars going rusty and all toasted, but we didn't actually say some of the cars are turned over, like upside down, and they've been levitated, and we never touched on that.
We didn't, and they're also on that WTC page. So, we can, let's just see if we...
Also, people witness testimony saying, I floated upstairs and similar, not quite that, but similar.
Let's mention 3 of them. David Hansher, the New York Daily News photographer. You Google his testimony, you'll see that he was levitated and carried a block as the tower was coming down. We have this famous 9/11 surfer, I think his first name's Blaise Pasquale, I think it's his name. He didn't come out until about 7 or 8 years after the events. I think he came out in 2010, and he says he was on the 26th floor, and he felt the building coming apart, and he kind of floated down to ground level, and he survived. And he actually became very depressed after this. He was one that was levitated, and then we've got accounts of a mysterious force going into his bag by René Davila. He talks about that. And another guy who was he was lifted off and thrown against the wall. I've got a video clip where he talks about that. And John Hutchison was essentially creating a levitation, an anti-gravity effect. This is what needs to be covered up at all costs. And guess what? By talking about bombs, nukes, just about anything, you can cover that stuff up really easily. And we've been talking about this since 2008. So we're now getting on for 7 years after we started talking about it. And still, hardly anybody knows about it. People know about 9/11 and all this stuff, but they don't know about Hurricane Erin. They don't know about John Hutchison. They don't know any of this because the Truth Movement has covered it up, and that's what my book is about. Let's just go back.
As Dr. Judy Wood says, the people who behind 9/11, they've put so much effort into doing the event. Do you think they forgot a cover story?
Correct. Do you think they forgot to plan a cover-up? The cover-up is even more criminal, I would argue, than the event itself because of what is allowed to happen. This is what we would argue. So, and I've written to David Ray Griffin, the author, I've written to him, I think twice now, to say that he is guilty of attempting to pervert the course of justice because he will not talk about what we've been talking about. He's written 5 or maybe 6 books about 9/11. You will not find John Hutchison's name mentioned anywhere in any of those 5 books, despite him submitting a court affidavit in a 9/11 related court case in 2007, which is on Dr. Wood's website, should anybody want to read it. I think before we get to the end, Matthew, I'd like to talk about going into the other side of the energy connection, our friend and Mr. Jones. Shall we talk about that?
Well, one sec. Before we get to John Hutchison, the military are completely aware of his work, having confiscated his work twice and getting him to work with the military, I think on 2 occasions. Maybe I might be wrong. So the Canadian military is taking all of yeah, well, I was going to briefly say, it's not just he's in his own house building these things. The military are aware of his work and they confiscated it. I think it were in
1990.
1990, but they did it twice. Twice they took all his equipment, I'm sure. Yeah,
so, I think that was later. They did it as well in 2008. I think it was. He had some happen. I don't think it was all confiscated.
I'm not unfamiliar with him.
Yeah, exactly. But the main.
I've got to bring that up. So if you want to move on to Stephen Jones.
Well, we'll just sort of tie into what you just said there, because Colonel John Alexander, who people can look up, he talks about UFOs and stuff like that and other stuff. He worked with John Hutchison in 1983, and he observed and documented some of the effects, the jellification of metal, which at that time when John was doing it, he couldn't reproduce it reliably. He's been able to reproduce it since. John Hutchison worked with John Alexander for 4 months doing these experiments, and at that time, Colonel John Alexander, head of the non-lethal weapons program, or he became that for a period of time, he was working for Los Alamos National Laboratories, which if people don't know, that's where the atomic bomb was developed in the 1940s, right? So we're not in good shape. We're not in good shape with this sort of these sorts of connections. Now, John was being investigated by them. He wasn't kind of trying to do things for them. But from what John told us, John Hutchison that is, they already knew what he was doing. They already knew the effects that he was going to create and the way that they were going to unfold based on what setup he had. So they were familiar with this technology in 1983. Now let's talk about another thing to try and dispel another myth. It is claimed that Dr. Judy Wood doesn't talk about the evidence of nuclear effects at the World Trade Center, such as the cancer that victims have suffered, which the nukers would claim is caused by the radiation. Well, there wasn't a substantial amount of nuclear radiation at the World Trade Center site, and you can take it out. Some of it will be just the poisonous kind of toxic cocktail of dust, dustified steel, dustified computers, justified. There was a little bit of asbestos as well, but that was actually they stopped using that halfway through the construction, I think, of one of the towers. But the thing that people need to understand, another of the key indicators that was found at the World Trade Center, which the nukers latch onto, is tritium. Tritium is a form of hydrogen. It's actually an isotope of hydrogen. It has, I understand, 1 or 2 extra neutrons in the nucleus, and I can't remember how many. But this was found about 50 times the normal level in water at the World Trade Center site. This was done with a Thomas Cahill study, I think. People have tried to claim that this proves that it was a nuclear bomb that went off because that's what happened. And that is true. You do get tritium when a nuclear bomb goes off. However, the amount of tritium created... No, that's one of them. Yeah, it's the only... how can I put it? The mainstream physicists will tell you it's the only way you can get tritium is from a nuclear reaction, either from a nuclear bomb going off. But there is another place, going back a few years now, where tritium was found to be being produced. And it was in experiments which were done in the late 1980s, early 1990s, in something called cold fusion. Cold fusion. That's not a good name for it. It should really be called low-energy nuclear reactions. People will go, that name. Yes, indeed. We'll get on to that, shan't we, in just a few closing minutes.